Robby, I hear you were extra industrious last night and you wrote a radar. What's on your mind these days?
I did indeed. Well, Brianna, a new study published by the Journal of the American Medical Association purports to track the spread of COVID-19 misinformation during the course of the pandemic and largely blames 52 specific doctors for promoting allegedly incorrect claims about the virus, about masks, and about vaccines. The authors of that study, which is called Communication of COVID-19 Misinformation on Social Media by Physicians in the U.S., well, they might need to double-check their own grasp of the facts because several statements that they describe as examples of misinformation are actually debatable, and one big claim cannot possibly be described as misinformation at all. I refer, of course, unsurprisingly, to the lab leak theory. Statements counted as misinformation in this study included the notion that, quote, the virus originated in a laboratory in China. As if anticipating strenuous objection to this, the authors weakly insist that the lab leak theory, quote, contradicted scientific evidence at the time. Well, this gets to the very root of the whole misinformation problem. There was no smoking gun indicating either a natural origin or a lab leak, and yet a group of scientific experts released a paper, Proximal Origins, at the behest of federal health czars Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, that explicitly ruled out a lab leak despite their own private concerns that this was a perfectly compelling explanation. Scientists who publicly lean toward the lab leak theory, including Alina Chan, who we've had on the show, of MIT and Harvard, were condemned. The lab leak theory did not contradict scientific evidence at the time. It just didn't. The evidence was ambiguous, and some scientists preferred the lab leak, while others preferred natural origin. In any case, a scientific study released today, in August 2023, no excuse for continuing to promote the fiction that the lab leak theory is misinformation. The theory is now endorsed by both the U.S. Department of Energy and the FBI. The Wall Street Journal has confirmed key reporting that would make the lab leak all but certain, namely that the first people to contract COVID-19 were scientists working at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So-called experts who purport to chronicle and correct the category of speech now known as misinformation have proven themselves more than capable of error, which calls into question their entire project. And the authors, by the way, did not respond to my request for comment. Falsely describing the lab leak theory as misinformation, however, is not the paper's only sin. The authors also make dubious claims about masks and mandates. So they cite as misinformation, quote, allegations of consequences of mask wearing, including medical and social or developmental effects, all of which were unfounded. All of which were unfounded. That's what they say. Quote, many physicians focused on negative consequences related to children and mask mandates in schools, claiming that masks interfered with social development despite lack of evidence, wrote the authors. That's just simply untrue, that masking children has no negative consequences whatsoever for their development. Strong claim. As Brown University's Emily Oster noted when she wrote about this, there is direct evidence that masks make it difficult to hear the speaker, and that this may be exacerbated for kids in loud classrooms. It stands to some logic that if you're trying to teach a young child to read or really do anything, it is valuable for them to be able to hear you. And social interactions are better if kids can hear each other and be heard by teachers. Putting all this together, it is reasonable to think that some aspects of learning or social skills may be impacted by masks, and indeed others have argued this. Well, these misinformation cops disagree. The paper, by the way, also takes issue with the claim that mask mandates were ineffective at stopping the spread of COVID-19, even though some studies did in fact cast doubt on whether mandates, not masks themselves, but the mandates requiring them, were doing much additional good. Lastly, the authors explicitly denounce as a conspiracy theory the idea that health officials, quote, censored information that challenged government messaging. The Facebook files and the Twitter files have documented exhaustively all the ways in which the federal government pressured social media companies to do precisely that. So understanding how false information spreads on social media is a worthwhile project. The authors of this paper don't seem to grasp that there are legitimate disagreements on a whole host of policy issues relating to COVID-19. The science is not settled, and it never is. Those who would seek to police misinformation should first define it accurately, or else they're committing the very same mistake they seek to correct.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I saw people taking legitimate shots at this particular write-up. I mean, if you're going to go out of your way to do a piece on misinformation and the best evidence you have of it are these really disputed claims that now, with the passage of time especially, seem to militate in favor of those who are considered to be misinformationists of the internet,
Right.
then you haven't done a very good job. Now, I certainly do think there was a bunch of wrong stuff that was said at the time that has gotten largely memory hold. And if you really wanted to do an article about that, you could. But the problem is that stuff has gone the way of the dinosaur. People aren't still harping on the claims that were found to be unsubstantiated and wrong. They have been focused on those things which ended up being validated by time, history, and science, but which were characterized so uncharitably in the beginning during a time of genuine confusion or trying to get to the bottom of something as the pandemic had first occurred. And why liberals are still caught up in this space, I really don't know, especially because there's still, I think, a lot of legitimate arguments to be had about whether or not, okay, so here are the risks. To your point, you say there are understandable risks of masking and learning how to communicate and read and things, especially as children are young and developmentally naive.
Sure.
But that's weighed out. You have to balance that against the potential risks of infection. It's usually not so bad in children, but an unknown virus, long COVID, all of these kinds of things. And at least having an honest conversation about the real risks that exist on both sides, however great or minor you think they are, it feels like a more approachable conversation, a good faith conversation, in a way that simply lying about it doesn't. Same with the myocarditis stuff. I think a much stronger argument would be, well, there are similar heart risks to young people that can happen rarely, but sometimes. If you have COVID, you're not vaccinated, it's bad, and you get hospitalized. Similarly, there are these risks that can happen from vaccination, particularly in this group of young men. So let's just get our heads together, compare the scientific studies, and enable people to make informed decisions based on who they are, what their biological background is, and all of these kinds of things. And instead, we just got anybody who's talking about myocarditis is a kook and lying and doesn't understand the science. And that has done irreparable damage, hopefully not irreparable, but very significant damage to the public trust.
Yeah, the people who purport to specialize in misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, who are journalists for which that's their beat, or who are national security experts or health experts with a focus on that, or tracking it online, groups that watch it, they increasingly refer to this category of speech in a way that is just baffling to me. Like that misinformation is itself a kind of virus, a kind of disease that is communicable and easily spread, and with no self-awareness or understanding that a lot of what they're describing as misinformation, is debatable, or is, as you just said, is just competing claims. Maybe one person might think, despite the mask being uncomfortable and not ideal for children, it's still worth doing it for these reasons. And someone else may say it's not worth doing it for these reasons.
Especially if your child is immunocompromised, has asthma, has other kinds of things. But if you don't do the full picture,
it's just misinformation. And again, with things that are just totally out of date now.
Now, there were, I don't want to memory hold the fact that there were people who were saying for purely political reasons, I'm not going to take this vaccine, who were ignoring the fact that there were these very high rates of, relatively compared to what we have now, high rates of hospitalization and death that were coming when people got COVID without having any layer of vaccine protection or having the protection of having had the disease initially.
Right, which is another...
Right.
I mean, that's a mainstream misinformation because there was so much unwillingness to embrace by Fauci and others that having had COVID would confer on you some degree of protection from a subsequent infection, and that was downplayed or even frankly was denied in mainstream reporting based on what government health sciences were saying. But that never counts as a misinformation. It's only when we do it.
Right, and I just saw a study that showed that if you ask conservatives how they feel about certain early COVID policies, mandates, et cetera, they are very negative about them. But if you call it Trump policies, the Trump mandates, et cetera, the opinion goes up. And so to me, that's not tethered to science or any kind of empiricism. That is politics. And I don't want to pretend that there wasn't a lot of politicking going on in the time, including people like Kamala Harris and liberals who were saying, well, if it's Trump's vaccine, I don't want to take it, right? So that is part of, I think, why there was a genuine investment in the
Peter
idea
Hotez.
of...
the same thing. Everyone's favorite mainstream COVID commentator when it was the Trump vaccine. They're like, oh, I don't know about this.
Yeah, so that's why I understand why some people were looking for something empirical, something true, something like science that they could hang their hat on, because there were people making wild decisions that were not well tailored to even good faith public health advice at the time. However, two wrongs don't make a right. And now we're having to contend with all of those years of flip-flopping advice on masks and incomplete advice on things like masks and which ones work and which ones don't, and how protective having had COVID really is versus isn't. And we're still digging ourselves out of that hole.
About that claim that it's a conspiracy theory that the government took actions, or the government health advisors took actions to discourage narratives that clash with them. Like, it's just not a conspiracy theory. Yeah. I mean, there are people saying that was true, that was good action that should be done and should be done again, but you can't deny that it happened. Crazy stuff. Yeah. Well, we will see if these authors ever respond to the numerous criticisms they were getting from me and from other people on social media, and we'll have more Rising right after this.